Hi, welcome to Fundamentals Friday. I thought we'd do something a bit different today. Instead of electronics or circuit design, I thought we'd take a look at the economics of selling your own hardware, because these days it's super simple. Anyone from their home can get into manufacturing and selling electronics. You can buy any part you can possibly imagine from DigiKey, a Mouser or some other supplier. PCBs are almost free, they're dirt cheap, and electronics assembly, the assembly of your PCB, everything else so cheap. And there's even like web-based turnkey solutions to do the whole thing. They'll manufacture your board, they'll assemble your board, they'll test it, they'll do everything, and you can go into the hardware business yourself. But I thought we'd take a look at the economics of it. Now, I've actually done a blog post on this several years back. So essentially, I'm going to redo the stuff I've done in that blog post. Now, there's a bit of a rule of thumb in regards to how much you should charge for your product. And this is basically 2.5 times the cost of goods sold. COGS, we'll call it. Nothing better than a four-letter acronym, is there? So if your product costs $100 to manufacture, including everything, as we'll talk about shortly, then you need to sell it for about $250 as a minimum to sort of stay in business. Where does this 2.5 figure come from? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at. Now, first take a look at how you price your product. There's actually two different methods of pricing your product. One is called the top-down pricing method. The other is called the bottom-up pricing method. The top-down method can be based on what similar products are priced at. So you look at the market out there, what are similar competing products. Your one's a bit better in some way, but you probably don't want to charge a lot more. You want it like a similar price to existing products. Or you could use this method if yours is the only product in the game, for example. Pretty much that includes the third point here, is that you could pretty much charge anything you want in a exclusive or more traditionally high-priced product, for example. So that could be the luxury goods market, or a market like, say, the audiophile market, for example, where people are just used to paying high prices for a valve audio amplifier or some other audio product or something like that. But basically it comes down to the fact that you can pretty much charge what the market is willing to pay. But there's obviously a downside. Say you wanted to make a new Arduino compatible board, for example. Well, people are used to paying pretty low prices for these boards. So it's not like you can come out with a new Arduino compatible board or an Arduino Shield and then charge $200 for it. The market's going to go, what? That's totally out of the price range that I expect. But of course, there's an obvious trap with this. A similar product here sells for $10 and you think that you can, make some big, huge business making a margin on a $10 retail cost board. It's probably not going to pay your wages to stay in business. So the market could be done and dusted right there if you're trying to compete in a highly competitive, low-cost market. The next method, the bottom-up pricing structure, is probably the most popular one used by people just starting out sort of like a side business making hardware products. You've got your idea for your great hardware product, you make a few prototypes, and you want to start a little business or side business selling the thing. What do you price it at? You've got no idea. So it could be the only product in the market, and you don't know what to price it at. So what do you need to price it at to stay in business? Well, you look at your manufacturing cost, your cost of goods sold, and then basically you put in a multiplier. We've mentioned the rule of thumb before, 2.5, and we'll see where this figure comes from that allows you to stay in business. The good thing about the bottom-up pricing structure and why a lot of people use it, it's probably the most popular, is that it's easy. You don't have to be concerned about, am I competing and all that sort of stuff? What should I charge? I'm so worried. I've got no idea, haven't been in this business before. The price is what it is. It costs you $100 in parts to manufacture this thing. You're going to sell it for 2.5 times that, or $250. And you can even be upfront with your customers and say, hey, look, the manufacturing cost is about this. I need to sell it for this to stay in business. And probably the majority of customers out there are, are going to appreciate the fact that you need to make a decent margin to stay in business. It's not like a cutthroat, $5 farty novelty toy from Alibaba in China, right? You need to pay your bills, you need to eat, you need to feed your family, everything else. But here's the thing, regardless of whether you use a top-down pricing structure to determine your price or the bottom-up, It doesn't matter which method you use or what retail price you choose, you need this sort of multiplier, this 2.5 times, to stay in business. If it's any lower than that, you risk going out of business pretty quickly. It must be noted that this is just a minimum baseline required to stay in business, especially if you have distributors, which we'll talk about. But hey, if you've got a really cool product that only costs you $10 to actually manufacture, but you add value in, you might have some software or something like that. A classic example of this might be the Saley Logic Analyzer, for example. The hardware itself isn't much. It might cost like $10, $20 to manufacture. It might sell for a couple of $100 because you've got all the software and the IP and the support and everything else that goes into the product. And if your product happens to be in that sort of market, well, that's fantastic, of course. If you can get away with a higher margin, by all means do. But before we look at our cost multiplier here, we have to know how much it costs us to manufacture our product, the cost of goods sold. It's not just the manufacturing cost, there's a lot of stuff involved here. Let's take a quick look at it. Your bill of materials parts, your BOM cost is the obvious one. That's the list of all your parts from your schematic for your project on PCB, including your case and all sorts of stuff. Plus, one thing a lot of people forget is the real overruns. When you're getting something manufactured, you're most likely going to be buying things in reels like this. You're going to be buying 1,000 of. If you only want to manufacture 100, you might have to buy them in 1,000, and you might have to amortize that cost, i.e. spread that cost into the cost of your first batch, because usually when you're costing a product for the first time, you usually want to do it for your first production run, or maybe you might, spread it over a second production run or something like that. But just be careful of real overruns. That can be an issue, but that gets difficult because different parts come in different real quantities and things like that, and so batch from batch it gets all a bit complicated, but you might have to add in something there. Of course, you've got your blank PCB, that's obvious. They're pretty cheap, but you could include that in your BOM cost. Then you've got your assembly cost. That's just your base level assembly cost from your assembler, how much it costs per board usually to assemble the thing. But of course, there will usually be a setup charge for that, so you have to amortize that cost into, say, your first production run, for example, might be $500 to set up the pick and place machine as a one-off cost to do that. Then you've got your testing and your programming. If you've got a modern product with a microcontroller, you need to program it. That could all be part of the assembly cost, or it could be separate depending on how your assembler charges that. Then you've got packing. Do you want your assembler to pack it, or are you going to do it yourself? If you're going to do it yourself, if you're going to hire someone down here to do that, then all that cost comes into it. And then you've got all the shipping for all the above. This is not shipping to the customer. This is shipping parts to you and then to your assembler, to and from, and all that sort of stuff. That can add up. Don't forget to include that. A lot of people forget that, and they wonder why they're not making as much as they should. Then you've got consumables. You've got all sorts of stuff that you've got to, pens and pencils and labels and envelopes and all sorts of things. You've got to remember the consumables. Then you might have taxes involved. We won't go into that, but you might need to in your country. And here comes that word amortize again, which means sort of like spread the cost across the entire thing. You have to amortize in the cost of defective units. You might get 100 shipped to you, but they might test 105 and find that 5 are defective. They're not going to pay for that. That's part of your cost. You've got to absorb that. So you might typically add in, say, 5%. Your first run could be higher than that, but it's not a bad rule of thumb, 5% extra boards. So if you've got a production run of 100 boards, costing 105, for example. Then don't forget you're going to lose some in shipping as well. It's just going to happen. People will go, I didn't get it, and you'll have to ship them a new one. Don't haggle with them, just ship them a new one. Build it into your cost here, typically a couple of percent. It shouldn't be as high as 5%. If it is, something's horribly wrong, but be sure to add in a couple of percent. And then you've got wages as well. Are you going to do it yourself, or are you going to hire someone to do the packing and shipping for you? Or you might hire a logistics company to do that for you. Well, you can include that down here as well. Now, normally I don't like to include the cost of shipping to the customer in my product. I typically just charge my shipping at cost. Sometimes I make a loss on it. Sometimes I make a gain depending on different countries, but all sorts of average out, and then I don't have to include that here. But there's a lot of things involved involved in the cost of goods sold. So you've got to add all these things up, put it in a big massive spreadsheet, add it all up. Sometimes you'll have to guess at these sort of things if you're working out if it's viable or not. You don't exactly have all sorts of quotes and things like that for everything. You might have to guess a few things. That's okay. Whack them in a big spreadsheet and you'll get a number out, and that is your cost of goods sold. And you want to sell it for at least 2.5 times is the usual rule of thumb. You can get away with less under circumstances we'll talk about, and you can get away with more, as we first looked at right at the start. Now we have to talk about distributors and how you're going to sell your product, because this could be a huge reason why you need at least this 2.5 multiplier here, or one of the reasons why you might be able to get away with a lower margin on your product. So let's take a look at it. The distributors, this can be, you know, the likes of Adafruit, Spark Fun, or insert a million other places to sell your product these days. But basically what they are is a retail storefront that sell your product. So the advantages, the pros of this are that they have a ready market. There's people going there all the time, shopping, they can advertise your product, they can promote it, they can, you know, include it in things, and people whack it in shopping carts along with other stuff. So if you're starting out and you don't have an existing audience, or, you know, you can't easily reach an audience for your product because you don't want to pay for marketing, don't do that, trust me. So that could be a real major reason that could make or break your product. If you can't somehow get to the customers, but a distributor can, then by all means a good reason to use them. And they also handle the shipping, the orders, the returns and the complaints and everything else. So no worries, they take away a lot of the hassle, and they buy in bulk, which makes things much easier, not dicking around with onesies and twosies. But of course there's downsides with going with distributors. This will vary with distributors, but typically they're going to want to make a 60% markup, and I'll explain in a minute what markup is, what that actually means. And they can actually make more per unit than you do. If they could make $50 a unit and you only make $30 a unit, and that may not sit right with you. It may not seem right. You have to outweigh the advantages and everything else. And it actually may not make your business or product viable at all. If you are selling into a cost-sensitive market, for example, you may not be able to have enough margin in there to account for the 60% markup of them, and the whole thing just may completely fall flat. You won't be able to feed yourself and you'll just go out of business. And the other thing is, it may not feel as satisfying. It may not feel like you're building a business yourself, because, you know, you're just sitting in your garage and you're just boxing up stuff and shipping off. Actually, you're not dealing with the customers. So that can actually be quite satisfying. So pros and cons both ways. You'll have to weigh it up yourself. Now, of course, you can actually do both. You can have a distributor. For example, I'm based here in Australia. I might have some overseas distributors, which makes selling into different overseas markets much easier, especially into Europe. Might be difficult to get into for outsiders, for example. So it could be worth running a combination of these things. But typically, just be careful. You're going to want to have the similar or same retail price for both, because the customers may go, huh? You're selling it under the price of your distributor, and your distributors may not like that. Your customers don't feel good about it. So just be careful. That can cause a bit of a conflict. And I forgot, a more technically correct term perhaps is reseller for that, because they're reselling retail, but I just use the terms interchangeably here. And also, I'm not talking about getting the distributor / reseller to actually manufacture the hardware for you, because a lot of companies will actually do this. They will take your design and they'll actually do everything. The bill of materials, they'll source the components, they'll assemble it, they'll test it, they'll pack it, they'll ship it, they'll do everything, and they might give you 10 or 15% of the retail price or something like that. So really that's a different ball game entirely, and you can actually make a business from that, just taking 10-15% off the top and getting somebody else, a reseller, to handle assembling and doing everything else, bill of materials, and all you do is get a check every month. But that's not really building the business that we're talking about here. All right, let's see how much profit we make, or as it's called, the gross margin percentage. Let's assume that we're making a turbo encabulator. Beauty. Okay, let's assume that our cost of goods sold is $50. Okay, that includes everything on that huge list that we saw before, everything to do with the business of making this turbo encabulator. And let's use our rule of thumb 2.5 times multiplier, which I'll still get to, trust me, and that gives us a retail price that we need to sell it at of $125. So the gross margin percentage is the revenue, i.e. the retail price, minus the cost of goods sold divided by the revenue times 100%. Easy, you should really already know this. That's a 60% gross margin percentage, or profit, essentially. So let's assume that we can sell 1,000 turbo encabulators per year, which is not much. You know, it sounds like a lot to a lot of people, but there's a big market out there. So, 1,000 is not a huge volume for a typical niche hardware product. So we make $75 profit on each one, times 1,000, it's easy. We make $75K a year. Beauty. You can conceivably quit your job for that, right? And just sell your turbo encabulator. And that's fantastic. But, what happens if we want to use a distributor, a reseller, to sell your product? The things change, because $75K a year might be fantastic for you. If you're doing all the work and everything else, that's effectively your wages. That's what you're getting paid after all the cost of goods sold and everything to do with the business. And you've got to pay tax on that, but that's your income. Effectively your wages if you're just doing it yourself. But if you want somebody else to do it, if you want distributors, resellers, that's a different story. Let's take a look. Now, right back at the start, I mentioned markup, and this is important. This is where it matters when you're selling through a distributor/reseller. I mentioned that they will typically want, the large ones anyway, will typically want a 60% markup. So markup is the retail price that either you've chosen or you've chosen in consultation with the reseller. The retail price divided by the reseller cost, i.e. the cost to them, minus 1. That's all it is. Now, this is often given in a percentage, but we didn't multiply by 100 there, so the figure's actually 0.6. But they'll typically tell you, we want a 60% markup, thank you. So they will do this calculation, and you need to do it too. What is their buy price, i.e. the price that you're going to sell it to them for? You simply rearrange that. It is the retail price divided by the markup plus 1. And remember, that's not 60%, it's that 0.6. So if we do the calculation for our $125 turbo encabulator here, it's $125 divided by 0.6 plus 1, or $78. That is what they are going to ask to buy it. If I sell it to them for $78, remember the cost of goods sold was $50, we're only making a $25 profit when we have per unit when we have a reseller. But when you were selling it on your own, you were making $75 profit per unit. Huge difference. And that might sound unreasonable. Why do the large resellers want a 60% margin? It's massive, right? Well, they have distributors as well, like the likes of Adafruit and SparkFun, for example. They have distributors in all these different countries. They have to sell it at a wholesale price to them, and they have to still make a profit. This is not uncommon at all in the retail trade. Take, for example, a bookstore, old-fashioned dead tree. Most of the profit on that is made by the bookstore. Then the distributor will get, and the publishing house, and right down the bottom, the author might get 10-15% of that retail price if they're lucky. So if the reseller is selling it for $125 and they're buying it from you for $78, they're making $47 per unit. That's assuming that they sell it direct themselves and not through one of their further distributors down the chain. So they're making $47 profit per unit. You're only making $28 profit per unit. Not so good, is it? So this is why pricing your product is vital, and also getting the correct cost multiplier in there. It matters so that you can make a viable business out of this if you have to use, or you decide to use, a distributor/reseller. You're not making as much as they are typically per unit, but that depends on your cost of goods sold and your cost multiplier. So now we're actually going to take a look at some graphs of this cost multiplier, actually put this into a spreadsheet and work out where this 2.5 comes from, because that's what I promised right at the start of the video. I can show you that 2.5, why it's a decent rule of thumb. All right, let's have a look at the spreadsheet. We've got our markup here of 60% or 0.6. We've got our cost in here, $50. We can change these to our heart's content. Then we can calculate various things, the retail price and the gross margin, if we gross margin percentage if we sell direct, our profit when we sell direct, the sell price to the distributor, the gross margin percentage if we go to the distributor, so that's difference between selling directly and going through a distributor, and a bunch of other stuff, the reseller profit difference. Anyway, we can go down here and we can plot this. I love graphs, of course, and let's take a look at this one. This is the difference between the blue line here is the one, our gross margin percentage if we sell directly to the customer ourselves. We don't have a reseller at all. And of course, obviously, we make a profit, we make a percentage gross margin on anything over our cost of goods. So we're going up to a cost multiplier between 1 and 5 here. So if it costs us $50, we sell it for $50, of course we're not going to make any profit, but anything over that is cream, okay? So that's looking pretty good. But you'll notice that if we have a look at the gross margin percentage, if we use a distributor, i.e. a reseller, because of that 60% markup, we have to sell at a cost multiplier of at least 1.6 times to break even, at least. So we've had a figure of roughly 2.5 here, and you can see that you start getting on the ballpark, and you see that the difference between these two here, once you go up to cost multipliers of 3, 4, 5, there's not much difference. You don't it's diminishing returns in terms of the difference that you'll get in profit between the two. And of course we can go in there and change this figure. Let's say we had a better reseller, 0.4%, then you would notice that we only need a 1.4 multiplier to break even, and so forth. So you can actually just go in there and change things to your heart's content. And if we have a look at this graph here, we'll try and get an idea of why that 2.5 multiplier matters, but it's not a hard and fast thing. It's more like maybe a psychological thing, if anything. It totally depends on your cost of goods sold and, other market factors and things like that. But if we have a look here at our blue one, okay, this is our profit. This is our dollar profit if we sell directly. The blue one there, obviously, anything over our cost of goods sold, our cost multiplier over 1, we make profit on that. And likewise, we've got the orange curve here, which once again, we need that 1.6 multiplier just to start making a profit. But so why 2.5? Well, if you have a look at around it, it's actually around about 2.3. Some people in the industry use a figure of 2.3, 2.4. I use 2.5, just sort of round it up. That means that you're making, look, on the right-hand y-axis here is the percentage difference in profit between what the reseller makes and what you make. At around about that 2.3 to 2.5 mark, you're looking at about 50%. It actually occurs at 2.3 there. So you're earning half of what the reseller does. And do you want to earn less than half? So you can clearly see it's not a linear function here, because once again, it gets down to 0 on the right-hand y-axis here. And once again, surprise, surprise, that 1.6 multiplier, because our reseller is asking for a 60% margin. So that'll slightly change. So what multiplier do you need to earn exactly the same profit as your reseller does? Well, look, it's precisely 4 here. Bam, at 100% there, at a cost of 4 times multiplier. So if your turbo encabulator costs $50, you need to sell it for $200 retail before you can earn the same profit, the same gross margin percentage as the reseller does. And often that'll price you out of the business. Some industries, you can easily get 4 times cost multiplier, but others, so this is why generally the rough rule of thumb is around about 2.3, 2.5 is my figure that I use, because you're earning half of what the reseller does. So there's some justification for a multiplier of 2.5, and as you can see, it starts to drop off fairly quickly under that. So if you're using a reseller, you're starting to become a borderline business under there. So anyway, it's not a bad value to work from when you're starting up your hardware business and you don't really know the economics of it. Oops, I realized I didn't show you the bottom of the y-axis there. Anyway, this will of course depend entirely on the markup that your particular reseller is charging. I've changed it to 0.5 or 50% markup now. And as you can see, instead of being a 4 times multiplier now, you only need a 3 times multiplier. And we can go all the way up here and we can change it again to 0.4, and that will change again completely. And as you can see, whoa, look at this, we only need a 2.3 multiplier to actually earn the same as the reseller does. So yeah, you got to be aggressive on these markups. So you can see the dramatic difference going through a reseller makes. It could actually make or break your business. As we said before, you could be earning 75k a year profit if you sold your 1,000 turbo encabulators using the figures that we got, and you could basically quit your job and turn that into a full-time business pretty much. But if you went through the reseller at the same retail price and the same cost and everything else, the same volume, you're only earning 28k a year. That's not enough to quit your job for. But hey, this is just one example using some numbers, just typical figures just plucked out of the air. Your product could be completely different and you can make a really huge viable business going through a reseller. But if you can do it yourself, I highly recommend it, because today there's many places to sort of advertise your product and get, forums, and through other video bloggers like myself, you send it in, you get reviews and word gets around and things like that. You don't necessarily have to go through a reseller, and it's by far the better option if you can actually sell it yourself. In fact, taking this example here, if you made $75 profit per unit, you only need to sell 373 of them to make that same 28k a year as you would selling 1,000 of them through the reseller. So the reseller has to add value at least 3 times. In this particular case, they have to sell 3 times as many as you would be able to sell yourself before you start seeing any extra profit out of it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It was longer than I was hoping it would be. I thought it'd be about half this length, but I covered quite a lot of stuff, and I hope you got something out of it, and I hope it's possibly encouraged you to start your own hardware business, start selling your own hardware. It's easy. Go for it. Catch you next time. Hi, now I know a lot of you out there like designing your own products, and that's fantastic. Now let's say you've come up with this great new design, okay? You've got this one-off, you've built it, works great, you've debugged it, fantastic, and you want to make 50 of them, 100, 500, 1,000. Think big, 10,000, 100,000. What do? How do you take your project from a one-off through to volume production? Well, I'm glad you asked,